Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach GP channel, and this is your post FP2 final thoughts for F1 Fantasy this weekend. Now, like usual, I'm going to keep it short and to the point to give you the best assets to use in your teams, which ones you shouldn't, and overall the best team selections for this weekend, and potentially a little bit looking ahead into Miami, as well as this weekend, if you're using Limitless for Miami, definitely is very important. So straight away, let's get into the list of assets that you should be using in F1 Fantasy. Now, this has to do mainly with their budget and a little bit to do with their points when we get to the A-tier drivers and constructors. However, as per usual with these videos, if I do not mention a driver on these lists, it realistically means you shouldn't be using them, and it's most likely because they're going to go down in budget. So A-tier wise, we have Oscar Piastri, which looks like the clear-cut winner for budget gains this weekend. Now, I'll get onto Lando Norris soon, but Oscar Piastri, good on points, good on budget. Again, you could say the same for both Mercedes, George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. However, with the FP2 results, it wasn't perfect, and also for me, I would only be using these two drivers as a second A-tier driver, not as your two times. And then funnily enough, you have Lewis Hamilton, as he isn't too far off that 0.1 million increase and then potentially a 0.3. So out of the Ferraris, he would be the one to use. And then on the middle ground, you have Lando Norris. Now, he needs a lot of points. He needs around 40 points to get up that 0.3 million increase. So for a lot of us, especially the people limitlessing in Miami, it doesn't really look worth it just in case he doesn't win the race. I know he looked good in FP2, crazy. However, if you just want to go for points, Lando Norris might be your driver for this weekend. Now, for A-tier constructors, of course, McLaren is your go-to constructor. They still look like the most dominant pairing on the grid at the minute. And then it does get quite hard with Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull. They all look like they could all go up in price, so that isn't an issue. And then it all just depends on what your value is, how many B-tier drivers you need to change around, because that is more important to make sure you don't lose budget out on your B-tier assets. So realistically, a lot of people will be sticking with Mercedes. However, Red Bull didn't look too bad and Ferrari weren't too far behind as well. Then going into the B-tier drivers, you have the likes of Hadjar, Behrman and Bortoletto. Then the middle ground, there's a lot of middle ground this weekend. And then going into the middle ground, again, there's a lot of leeway because most of them will be going down in budget and you sort of had to just bite the bullet in Jeddah. And that's the likes of Ocon, Doohan, Alonso, Lawson and Albon and Gasly. Realistically, if you had one of those drivers with the likes of Behrman and Hadjar, then you are sitting pretty. And then B-tier constructor wise, again, the top two that look pretty good for getting that 0.6 million budget would be Haas and Racing Bulls, Alpine and Aston Martin. However, if they did get a DNF, it could be a little bit difficult. So with that said and done, let's go on to the FP2 results. And realistically, for me, my favourite team hasn't changed a lot. However, there are quite a few things that could change for other team selections. So Lando Norris, like I mentioned, looked really good so far this weekend in FP1 and FP2. Now again, his budget building is really an issue, which is the main drawback from him. But like I said, points, he looks good. Yuki Tsunoda, again, he actually looked quite quick in that Red Bull. However, with him crashing out in FP2, it is a bit of a risk. And do you want to take that risk? Potentially if you could get a -20 to your name? For me, I would still steer clear of Yuki Tsunoda. And then again, another driver who looked pretty good in FP2, but I still wouldn't go near, is Nico Hülkenberg. Because of him getting disqualified in Bahrain, he really cannot go up in budget. He will get that -0.6. So no matter what points he gets you, it won't be worth dropping that -0.6 in your team. And then finally, Pierre Gasly did look good in FP1, and even in FP2, he wasn't too bad. So again, with the amount of points he got in Bahrain, he wouldn't be a terrible shout coming into Jeddah and into Miami. So now finally, before we get onto the team selections, let's talk about the chips you can use. And realistically, I'm still on the no chips being used this weekend. Now, I know you can use Limitless. However, I really do think it still is a better option to use it in Miami or the likes of Imola even, because potentially would have a bit more knowledge on what the B-tier drivers are increasing. Because in a weekend like this, using Limitless, when a few of those B-tier drivers could be going down, I just think Miami and Imola gives us a bit more leeway to get even better results. And then realistically, if you want to use Limitless in Miami, you really do have to use the team selections with McLaren and Haas in to make sure you get those budget gains for Jeddah and for Miami. Now finally, let's head on to the team selection. Now the first team selection is still my favourite for this weekend, and it is because of the budget building potential. You have Piastri, Russell, Ocon, Behrman and Hadjar with McLaren and and Haas. Now, this primarily is the team if you are focusing on limitlessing in Miami. Now, George Russell doesn't look amazing, but I'm sure Mercedes will bounce back. Again, if you don't trust Russell, you could easily, potentially, if you have the budget, go up to a Lewis Hamilton, or even drop it down to an Antonelli, or even if you're thinking crazy, you could even go Yuki Tsunoda. However, this team sets you up brilliantly for that limitless in Miami. Definitely is one I'm going to get. It probably would only score 10-ish, 20 points less than the McLaren Mercedes Piastri team, which I'll get onto now. So it's still my favorite for this weekend, probably the one I will be using. And then, like I mentioned, you also have the Piastri McLaren Mercedes team, and this would also have Ocon, Behrman, Hadjar, and then one of those middle ground B-tier assets. It could be Doohan, it could be Alonso, it could be Gasly, it could be Albon. My money's on either having Alonso or Gasly in that spot at the minute, because I just don't trust Doohan there, or potentially either Bortoleto as well, as he can not go down in price. However, this team again will probably get you the most points. However, if you want a variation to this team, you could also bring in Red Bull or Ferrari, depending on your price tag. A lot of people will be able to do definitely Red Bull, also Ferrari. So, depending on those FP2 results, if you do think Red Bull are worth that risk of even Yuki Tsunoda crashing out, they don't look too shabby this weekend. Hopefully they can get some pit stop points this weekend as well. And then, of course, Ferrari, Charles Leclerc has been pretty good this weekend so far. And then finally, for the team selections, you still have the big budget gains. Now, this team would have Piastri or Norris, as you can afford either of them. It really depends on what sort of team you're using in Bahrain, with McLaren and Haas. Now, Haas guaranteed basically to get that 0.6. Then you have the A-tier driver of Piastri or Norris potentially going up in budget as well. And then you bring in Hadjar and Behrman definitely to get that 0.6 million. And then again, Ocon sets you up pretty nicely heading into Miami, as he still has that 15 for Bahrain. So realistically, he probably won't go up this weekend, but he could still get you that minus 0.2 and then potentially a 0.6 in Miami. Again, it really comes down to who do you use as that last driver. For me, I think Bortoleto is playing it safe, which I quite like, as he cannot drop in value. However, if you want to play it a little bit more risky, Alonso and Gasly are there. However, that is all I really need to talk about for this post FP2. It really does look like a complete toss-up if you could bring in Ferrari, Mercedes, or Red Bull this weekend if you're going for the big points teams. However, if you're like me and you need to keep on that budget building to make sure you get the best of the limitless in Miami or potentially even Imola, you don't have to worry about that, because we are looking at McLaren and Haas. So it really is pick and choose which strategy you want to use. But anyway, as always, thank you all so much for watching. For anyone who has been watching the video, you would have seen the points that every driver and constructor needs to gain budget at the top of the screen. And as always, comment down below if you have any more questions for me to answer, and I will get to all of them. So thank you all so much for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you all very soon. Take care.